Hi everyone, my name is Kat and I'm in my second year of teaching at a secondary school in Brisbane, Australia. I'd like to begin this presentation by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. My presentation today is part of a larger study that is ongoing, but I will be talking about one aspect in the 10 minutes that I have about the challenges and possibilities for new graduate teachers entering the teaching profession to build language and literacy, expertise, leadership and change. This study has its roots during my time at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, where I was studying my master's degree to become a teacher in the areas of legal studies and TESOL. As the university had picked these two specialist areas for me, TESOL was very new to me. Being in Dr. Julie Choi's TESOL classes, I started to realise just how important language and literacy was for schools and students. But I felt fearful graduating as a language and literacy teacher without much knowledge as to what this actually meant. And so, as I asked Julie to become my mentor, she took me into her language and literacy workshops and taught me so much about translanguaging practices and explicit language knowledge. In awe of what I was learning, I initiated a conference presentation with her to share with other teachers this knowledge. As I wanted to carry all of this expertise into the field, this turned out to be a lot harder than I expected. Entering the field in my first year, I was completely overwhelmed and experienced what most beginning teachers and the literature calls a transition shock. These quotes from two first-year teachers captures much of the shock that many new graduates experience. Feelings of being thrown into a sea of paperwork, screaming students, angry parents, and being micromanaged without any support. The culmination of these struggles for many beginning teachers is to walk away, that teaching is not worth the stress and the pain. With the main goal being to survive my first year, I quickly realized that enacting any kind of language and literacy expertise was going to be difficult. For beginning teachers, many schools would allocate additional support in the form of professional development, a time for teachers to meet with leaders and learn new practices and seek support. Although these sessions were well intended, they relied heavily on survival guidebooks where much of our professional learning was reduced to a formulaic approach. Having to practice routines and complete handouts, I found my desires to build language and literacy expertise stunted. Frustrated by what I was and wasn't learning, I started journaling and spoke to Julie about what I was going through. The more we spoke, these discussions between Julie and I started to have an impact within my school, particularly in the area of English as an additional language or dialect, which we call EALD in Australia, or which you may know as ESL or EFL. Being in a school where there was no EALD program at all, it was hard to come in as a new teacher and enact change. With Julie's guidance on content and pedagogy, I was able to lead professional development workshops for other teachers and small reading groups with Julie's help. For my own classrooms, implementing tasks learned from my pre-service years, such as language portraits and language trajectory grids, made multilingualism visible not only on the walls but also at the school. Our work together was enriching, but not without its challenges. Having many different priorities meant that my mentoring relationship with Julie didn't have an enduring effect. Because we were so time poor, we could only speak to each other every 2 to 3 months, a phone call here or an email there. When we did get the opportunity to talk about the challenges that I was facing, my professional growth was not built in a systematic way. It was quite random. Despite these pockets of growth being nourishing for both Julie and I, one can just imagine how hard and difficult it is to do this work, especially when our bodies are so tired and exhausted from our day-to-day jobs. But when faced with these realities of being so time poor and juggling such a massive workload, we can't help but ask ourselves, how did it become this way? How are beginning teachers being supported, and what are they learning and being nourished by? A turn to the extant literature shows us how very little is known about what beginning teachers engage with and what they find helpful and unhelpful for their professional development. Thus, the aim of this study was to precisely identify the school-initiated practices, so the things done by the school, and the non-school initiated practices, the things done between Julie and I, that were helpful or unhelpful for my professional development as a beginning teacher, and why. This research is significant because it will help improve the lives of beginning teachers by alleviating the pressures experienced within their transition to the profession, and it will help address the revolving door of new graduate teachers that quit the Australian teaching profession. So to start our study, I realised that I had a lot of things that I had been keeping. Various journals, diary entries, and blogs, things that I had been writing mostly just for myself from my first year of teaching. It came to a point where Julie and I started to think that these materials were really important for our work, and so these artifacts became our materials for critical reflection. We then adopted this new research methodology called dual ethnography, where Julie and I could work together as partners in this study to dialogically critique and question these artifacts to look for the helpful and unhelpful practices. To firstly identify these practices in a methodical way, we used a spreadsheet to map out the first year of teaching and chronologically ordered all of the school-initiated and non-school-initiated events that I undertook in my first year. Adopting a practice lens, we look for the ways in which things were done in each event. I'll break down an example of how we systematically organized and deconstructed one event according to practice, so what was done, the activities, so the things that constituted the practice, the critical incidents, so any key moments, and the affect, the intense emotion. You can follow this deconstruction with me by looking at the numbers on the right-hand side of the spreadsheet. So looking to the right in the left-hand column, we can see in the school-initiated space on the 15th of January that the practice of professional development occurred one morning. From this, we identified the activity attached to the practice, which required teachers to complete 3 hours of online modules. The incident identified in the artifact was about the lack of time allocated, and the affect revealed that this practice was dry and boring, and therefore not professionally conducive. Being able to zoom in on each of these practices, Julie and I used dual ethnography to engage in a dialogue and to elicit which practices were helpful and the ones that were unhelpful for professional development. A process of coding took place, and common patterns and themes emerged. Now, whilst many helpful and unhelpful practices transpired, I can only speak to one aspect of the findings. In the next slide, I will juxtapose the practice of a staff meeting in the school space with the mentoring conversation in the non-school space to show what was found helpful and unhelpful for professional development and why. So looking at the school space on the left-hand side, we can see that the practice of professional development was constituted by activities such as conducting self-assessments. In this task, teachers were given a handout to tick boxes assessing their own teaching practice. These practices were found to be unhelpful as ticking boxes were a quick, mechanical task. When these self-assessments would be used for a review, a routinized form of talk would take place. And as talk was unilateral, coming from one direction, didactic instructions would be given for teachers to carry out what has been instructed for improvement. However, these instructions were also hard to follow due to there being a lack of pedagogical guidance as to what beginning teachers needed to do to improve professionally. Compared to the non-school space, the practice of a mentoring conversation was helpful, as we can see that when two people come together and brainstorm a research project, it sparked the co. For us, collaborating was more than just cooperating. Collaborating together through research was a way to co-construct new knowledge as we engaged in co-learning with complementary roles to both bring something to the table. To foster bidirectional learning, we learnt that because research was not something I had a lot of knowledge in, one person needed to do this leading, and that was Julie. The role that I took on was one that was more open, flexible, actively engaging in conversation with Julie to translate these ideas into the school context. These productive dialogues allowed me to tap into Julie's knowledge, skills, ideas, and for her to tap into my understandings on the ground. Together, we could push forward our thinking and open up possibilities to expand language and literacy knowledge in new ways. So when we contrast the helpful and unhelpful dimensions together like this, they look worlds apart. On one hand, there are many lifeless practices in the school spaces that places strict boundaries over what beginning teachers are able to do, and that what we see here feels very militarized. On the other hand, we see lifeful practices that frame the non-school spaces with learning, and this was empowering as it led to a sense of feeling liberated. So now that we know some of the helpful activities, what kind of change would it take to implement new programs that embody these activities at the heart of schools? One has to acknowledge that this cannot be done overnight, as many of these unhelpful activities have emerged due to the era that we live in, being driven by the dominance of neoliberal agendas. But through what we have identified, what we know works is that as teachers, we have enormous power. We have the power to name the activities that are helpful and unhelpful. To do so, we must find the adjectives to describe these activities. It is through this process of naming that we can identify the structures that need to change. But in order to name these activities, one has to have tools. The foundational tool for our study was through research. Within research, the approach that happened to work for us was the duo ethnography. This tool allowed us to engage in a mentoring teacher-researcher relationship to name the activities that were helpful and unhelpful. However, we need more tools to name the many issues that remain unidentified in many different contexts. It is here that we would really encourage for there to be more qualitative studies that can provide us with further tools to make visible the practices and name the activities that need to be changed. But the questions that ultimately remain are, what would need to change for these things to become possible? Even if we know what is possible, what will it take? We know that schools are very complex systems, intertwined with other systems, that no one person or group can just change things. Thus, to do this work requires a collective dialogue. In the first instance, there needs to be a dialogue within the school in the micro, meso, and macro spheres. This dialogue in turn will allow us to join forces across different cities, states, and systems to do this work. Thank you for listening to this presentation.